Hello, hello. Welcome back to Let's Talk HP Lovecraft. Have you subscribed yet? If not, encouraging to do that now before we get started, because today we are talking about another great HP Lovecraft story in the form of The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, written 1927, first published in an abridged serialized version in Weird Tales in 1941, and unfortunately not published completely unabridged in one piece until 1943 by Arkham House. So this is among Lovecraft's stories, one of the longer pieces that he ever wrote at about 52,000 words or so. If you're doing an audiobook version, take you a little over 5 hours, let's call it 5.5 hours just to be safe. Yeah, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. I've read this one time previously, and it was fun to spend a big chunk of time over the last couple days rereading it, revisiting it, and seeing if I enjoyed it a little bit better than the previous time when I felt a little bit lost at times. But yeah, guys, I'm going to talk about it, give you a little bit of synopsis of the plot, and then maybe talk a little bit about how I felt about the story afterwards. The story starts in 1928. Charles Dexter Ward has just apparently escaped from a mental hospital. The narrator, he basically spends most of the story recounting how the family physician, Marinus Bicknell Willett, pieced together the several-year decline of Charles Dexter Ward that led him to be imprisoned in this institution. After finding a painting of his ancestor, his previously unknown ancestor, Charles Dexter Ward becomes obsessed with the painting. He becomes obsessed with some papers he finds that were written apparently by his great-great-great-grandfather, and he begins to become obsessed with recreating and finishing that man's work. A big portion of the novel is spent far in the past, about 150 years, where the ancestor, Joseph Curwen, he'd been doing some interesting research in secret in a clandestine underground lair, but he pisses off the locals. This is not far removed from witch trial times, and they end up ransacking his laboratory, collapsing it, burning him alive, and burying his ashes in secret. But in the 20th century, Charles Ward uses some of Curwen's notes and adds to his knowledge by spending several years studying in Europe and meeting with other strange people. When he comes home, he locates the former lab, he expands it, he does more excavations, and he continues the work. But over time, his behavior becomes increasingly alarming. There's always strange sounds and strange, horrible smells emanating from his room and his library, and of course his new laboratory that nobody quite knows where it is below. He's going downhill. Eventually, he is committed to a mental hospital. Ultimately, we learn that Ward he unwittingly resurrected his great-great-grandfather, Joseph Curwen, who killed him, because they looked similar, attempted to double as him. He even at times dressed up as somebody else to pretend to be another person. But he had this whole conspiracy going on involving not just himself, but some other friends who their own research from 150 years ago also survived. And what they were doing was they were using the so-called essential salts of people and beings, and using them to resurrect these beings so they can milk their knowledge from them, their ancient lost knowledge, and also ultimately probably create an army, and use that to basically conquer the world with their advantage of knowledge, which is pretty cool, considering that this was written in the early 1900s, and we're just a few decades away from the nuclear bomb and then explosion of science and technology. So imagine if you are the guy who has this giant leap forward in knowledge and technology just before all that takes place. Dr. Willett, the psychologist, he eventually pieces together a conspiracy and figures out that Curwen is an imposter. He kills him, and do they all live happily ever after? Probably not. This is Lovecraft. All right, guys. It's an interesting tale. It's very complex, possibly even convoluted at time. I must admit that first time I read it, I did not actually get it. I did not catch the idea that that Curwen had replaced Charles Dexter Ward. I thought he possessed him. But nonetheless, it's an enjoyable read. Lovecraft did not like this tale. I like it probably more than Lovecraft did, but it is not his best. It's a little bit long-winded for him. I find that he works better in a shorter format. I think some people just aren't meant to be like novelists. Although this one has been called a novel, I'd call it a novella at 52,000 words. But primarily, and the best feature of this story is that it is a mystery. If you took out all the supernatural elements, that part would still work. Just the idea that people were able to use a combination of research and records and genealogy and then just bits of science and all these different elements to come to this conclusion from a past that in Curwen's time was deliberately buried. You know, they tried to hide this, and and it almost worked. Another good feature of the story is how Lovecraft weaves together history, religion, magic, his own personal mythos. Yog-Sothoth is heavily featured, but also science and psychology and all these different things, all these different elements of everyday life and of fictional life and of past religious life and mythological life, and he weaves all of them together into a sort of new and original concept of his own. I love the idea that while essentially Dexter and Curwen were, they're wizards, they're alchemists, but they're also using science. There's a heavy chemistry element involved as well. So I love the idea that all of these things come together. It kind of reminds me of the old saying about any technology sufficiently advanced would appear to be magic to those who don't know about it, and that's sort of like the case here, where these characters are tapping into something from beyond that. Sort of, I would call like the technology of the the gods, of the outer ones, the other ones, the other gods, whatever they're called. And sort of summoning them to Earth, and sort of like the humans, stealing fire from the gods in that respect. So that is pretty cool. Story definitely needs a big screen adaptation. I think there was a version in the 60s, and there's been some radio versions and stuff like that, but I think this story is ripe for big screen adaptation. I sort of envision it as sort of like a Godfather 2 situation, where you tell the two stories side by side. The past version, the past scenario, and then the current scenario, and then that way you preserve the mystery of who is who. Whereas I think it was a little bit predictable in Lovecraft, and that is probably the worst part here. Is it was obvious that there was possession being involved here in resurrection and all these things, but I think Lovecraft, it's difficult when that's the point of your story, because you can't, you don't want to come out and say it, but yet it's not easy to hide, and if you try to hide it, then it becomes less impactful. So it's sort of a vicious circle. But I think Lovecraft did a better job than he thinks he did, and I'm reading it today, all these decades later, so I guess he did something right. All right, guys, those are my thoughts on the case of Charles Dexter Ward, written 1927, first fully published in 1943. It amazes me what Lovecraft was able to come up with sort of pre-World War II. It's amazing. Very far ahead of his time. We're just now beginning to appreciate him. And guys, that's it. That's all I have for today. I will be back soon with another review. Looks like the next story on the lineup is The Descendant. After that, just a few more stories to go, though of course a couple of them are quite long, so yeah, give me time. Alright guys, thanks for tuning in. Talk to you again later, and until next time, keep it creepy.